The icy water of the Platte River stole Grace Wakefield's breath as she plunged beneath the surface, her sodden skirts dragging her down like anchors into the murky depths. It was May of 1875, and she had decided the world would be better without her in it. The roaring current pulled at her body, tumbling her over smooth river stones as her lungs began to burn. Just as the edges of her vision darkened, a strange peace settling over her strong hands gripped her shoulders, yanking her upward into the painful brightness of day. "What in tarnation do you think you're doing?" A deep voice bellowed as Grace coughed and sputtered, river water streaming from her nose and mouth. Through blurred vision, she made out the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered against the afternoon sun. Her rescuer dragged her to the riverbank where she collapsed, half drowned and wholly disappointed that her attempt had failed. "Trying to die," she managed between gasps, her voice hollow and raw. The man knelt beside her, and as her vision cleared, she saw his face properly weathered by sun and wind, with eyes the color of the Wyoming sky and a strong jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble. Water dripped from his dark hair onto a face that looked both concerned and vexed. "Well, that's about the most foolish thing I've ever heard," he replied, his expression softening as he took in her bedraggled appearance. "Whatever troubles you've got, drowning yourself won't solve them." Grace turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "You know nothing about me or my troubles." "I know enough," he said, rising to his full height and looking down at her with an unexpected gentleness. "My name's Clayton Reed. I've got a small ranch about 3 miles east of here, and if you're that determined to leave this world behind, then I've got a proposition for you." Grace looked up, confused. Clayton extended a hand to help her stand. "Live with me instead." The words hung between them as Grace stared at him in disbelief. "What? You heard me. If you're done with your old life, then start a new one. I could use help around the place, and you." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "You clearly need somewhere to go that isn't the bottom of this river." Grace trembled, partly from the cold water soaking her clothes and partly from the absurdity of his offer. "You don't even know my name." "Then tell me." "Grace." "Grace Wakefield." "Well, Miss Wakefield, what do you say? It's a sight better option than drowning, I'd wager." She hesitated, considering the strange turn of events. She had walked into the river fully intending never to walk out again. Now this stranger, this Clayton Reed, was offering her a lifeline she hadn't asked for. "Why would you help me?" she asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. She had learned the hard way that men rarely offered assistance without expecting something in return. Clayton shrugged, his expression unreadable. "Maybe I don't like seeing life wasted. Maybe I'm lonely. Maybe I just need someone to help with the cooking. Does it matter? The offer stands." Grace looked back at the river, its waters still rushing by indifferently. Then she looked at the hand Clayton still held out to her. With a deep breath, she reached out and placed her cold fingers in his warm palm. "All right, Mr. Reed, I accept your offer." Clayton nodded, a hint of relief crossing his features. "Good. My horse is tied up yonder. Can you ride?" "Yes." "Then let's get you dried out and fed. You can tell me what drove you to such desperate measures once you're feeling more yourself." As Clayton helped Grace onto his horse before mounting behind her, she felt the solid warmth of his chest against her back. She had no idea who this man truly was, or what awaited her at his ranch. But one thing was certain: it couldn't possibly be worse than what she was leaving behind. The ride to Clayton's ranch was mostly silent. Grace was too exhausted and confused by the turn of events to make conversation, and Clayton seemed content to let her be with her thoughts. The rhythmic motion of the horse beneath them and the steady breathing of the man behind her lulled Grace into an almost trance-like state. The landscape around them was rugged but beautiful, rolling plains giving way to distant foothills, with the occasional cottonwood offering shelter from the late afternoon sun. After about an hour's ride, a modest homestead came into view. "That's it," Clayton said, his voice close to her ear. "Not much to look at, but it's home." The ranch consisted of a small but solidly built log cabin, a barn, a corral with a few horses, and some fenced pastureland where a small herd of cattle grazed. It was indeed humble, but there was something appealing about its simplicity. As they approached, a dog came bounding out to meet them, a black and white border collie that barked excitedly at their arrival. "That's Ranger," Clayton explained as he dismounted and then helped Grace down. "He's a good herding dog and a better companion." Grace's legs wobbled as her feet touched the ground. The events of the day and her near drowning had left her weaker than she'd realized. Clayton steadied her with a strong hand. "Easy now. Let's get you inside." The interior of the cabin was sparse but tidy. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a wooden table and chairs nearby. A curtain separated what appeared to be a sleeping area from the main room. There were a few shelves with books, some cooking implements, and not much else in the way of personal belongings. "You live here alone?" Grace asked, her voice still raspy from the river water. Clayton nodded as he stoked the embers in the fireplace to bring the fire back to life. "Just me and Ranger for the past 2 years. Had a ranch hand for a while, but he moved on to California last fall." Grace stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, water still dripping from her clothes onto the wooden floor. She had no idea what to do next or what Clayton expected of her. As if reading her thoughts, Clayton gestured toward the curtained area. "There's a trunk with some clothes that might fit you. They belonged to my sister when she visited last year. You can change behind the curtain. I'll heat some water for tea." Grace moved hesitantly to the area he'd indicated and found the trunk at the foot of a neatly made bed. Inside were several simple dresses and undergarments. She selected the plainest dress she could find, a faded blue calico, and quickly changed out of her sodden clothing, grateful to be rid of the heavy, wet fabric. When she emerged, Clayton had a pot of water heating on the stove and was slicing bread at the table. He glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "Better?" he asked. "Yes, thank you for the clothes." He nodded and continued with his task. "You must be hungry." "I don't have much, but there's bread, some jerky, and I think there's still some stew left from yesterday." Grace realized suddenly that she was, indeed, ravenously hungry. She hadn't eaten since the previous evening, having been too focused on her grim purpose to think about food. "Stew sounds wonderful," she admitted. They ate in relative silence, Grace too self-conscious and Clayton apparently not one for idle chatter. As the daylight began to fade, he lit a lamp and placed it on the table between them. "So," he finally said, pushing his empty bowl aside, "are you going to tell me what drove you to try ending your life today?" Grace stared into her tea, watching the steam rise in curling tendrils. "It's not a pleasant story." "I didn't figure it would be." She took a deep breath, deciding how much to reveal to this stranger who had saved her life and brought her into his home. "I was engaged to be married, to a man I thought was kind and honorable." Clayton waited patiently as she gathered her thoughts. His name was Edward Parker. He was the son of a successful merchant in Denver. We met at a social gathering last year and he pursued me quite determinedly. I was flattered by his attention. My parents died in a typhoid outbreak when I was 16, and I've been living with my aunt ever since. She was eager to see me settled. Grace's hands trembled slightly and she clasped them tightly around her mug. 2 months ago, Edward asked me to marry him. I accepted. Everything seemed perfect until... She paused, the memories still raw and painful. "Until," Clayton prompted gently. until I discovered he was already married, had been for 3 years, to a woman in St. Louis. The bitterness in her voice surprised even her. When I confronted him, he laughed, said I was naive to think a man like him would seriously marry someone like me, that I had been convenient entertainment while he was in Denver on business. Clayton's expression darkened. The man sounds like a scoundrel. He is worse than that, Grace continued, finding that now she had started, the words came more easily. When I threatened to expose him, he became violent. He hurt me. Said if I told anyone, he would ruin what was left of my reputation by spreading rumors that I had been improper with him. She unconsciously touched her ribs where the bruises were still healing. My aunt believed him over me. The community began to whisper. I couldn't bear the shame or the betrayal, so I left Denver 3 days ago with what little money I had saved. When that ran out, well, you know the rest. Clayton was silent for a long moment after she finished speaking. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. No man has the right to treat a woman that way. Your Edward Parker sounds like the kind of man who deserves a good thrashing. A small, sad smile touched Grace's lips. Perhaps, but it doesn't matter now. I can never go back to Denver. No, I suppose you can't. Clayton rose and took their bowls to a wash basin. You can stay here as long as you need to. I meant what I said about needing help around the place. It's hard running a ranch alone. And what exactly would my duties be, Mr. Reed? Grace asked cautiously. She was not so naive as to think a man would take in a strange woman without expectations. Clayton seemed to understand her concern. Cooking, cleaning, mending, normal household things. I spend most of my time with the cattle and horses. The house has been neglected. Beyond that, I've no designs on you if that's what you're asking. You'll have your privacy and my respect. Relief washed over Grace. Thank you, I don't know what else to say. You don't need to say anything else. Clayton gestured toward the curtained area. You can take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire tonight. Tomorrow we can figure out a more permanent arrangement. As Grace settled into the unfamiliar bed that night, listening to the occasional crackle of the fire and Clayton's quiet movements in the main room, she wondered at the strange turn her life had taken. That morning, she had been determined to end her life. Now she was beginning anew in the home of a man she barely knew, in a place she'd never been. It was terrifying, and yet, somehow, there was a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. It took her a moment to recognize it as hope. The first rays of dawn filtered through the small window when Grace awoke the next morning. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she sat up quickly, her heart pounding. She could hear movement in the main room, the quiet clink of cookware and the soft murmur of a man's voice talking to a dog. Drawing aside the curtain slightly, she saw Clayton at the stove, Ranger sitting attentively at his feet. "Morning," Clayton said without turning around. "Coffee's almost ready." Grace quickly dressed in another of the dresses from the trunk, a simple brown one that seemed practical for ranch work, and emerged from behind the curtain. "Good morning. I should be the one making breakfast," Clayton shrugged. "Been making my own for years." "No rush to change habits on your first day." He poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. "How did you sleep?" "Better than I expected," Grace admitted. The bed had been comfortable, and exhaustion had pulled her quickly into a dreamless sleep. They ate a simple breakfast of fried salt pork and biscuits left over from Clayton's previous baking. As they ate, he outlined the day ahead. "I need to check on a section of fence on the north pasture and move some cattle. Probably be gone most of the day." He glanced around the cabin. "Feel free to make yourself at home. There's a vegetable garden out back that could use some attention if you're feeling up to it." Grace nodded. "I can do that, and perhaps clean up a bit in here." Do whatever you like. My house is your house now." After Clayton left with Ranger trotting at his horse's heels, Grace stood in the middle of the cabin, taking stock of her surroundings in the full light of day. The place was tidier than most bachelor accommodations she'd heard about, but it was clear that it hadn't had a woman's touch in some time. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work. She swept the floors, washed the breakfast dishes, and organized the kitchen area. She found some dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams and arranged them more neatly. The work was therapeutic, giving her mind something to focus on besides her troubles. By midday, she had made significant progress on the cabin's interior and ventured outside to examine the vegetable garden Clayton had mentioned. It was overgrown with weeds, but she could see that it had once been well tended. Tomato vines struggled among the invaders, and she spotted rows of carrots, onions, and potatoes that needed attention. Grace found some gardening tools in a small shed and set to work, grateful for the physical labor that left her too tired to dwell on painful memories. The Wyoming sun was strong, but a gentle breeze made the work bearable. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't notice Clayton's return until his shadow fell across the garden plot. Looking up, she shielded her eyes against the sun. "You've been busy," he observed, taking in not just the partially weeded garden but the washing she had hung on a line near the cabin. "It helps to have something to do," Grace replied, rising to her feet and brushing dirt from her hands. "I hope you don't mind that I went through your things to organize them." "Not at all." He dismounted and led his horse toward the barn. "Actually, it's nice coming back to a place that looks lived in." Grace followed him, watching as he unsaddled his horse and began brushing the animal down. His movements were efficient and gentle, and the horse nickered softly in apparent appreciation. "This is Traveler," Clayton said, patting the gelding's neck. "Best cow horse I've ever had." "He's beautiful," Grace said, admiring the chestnut quarter horse. "Do you have other horses?" "4 others. 2 for working cattle, 1 for pulling the wagon, and a mare that's due to foal next month." He finished with Traveler and turned to her. "Do you ride?" "I used to. My father kept horses when I was growing up." Clayton nodded. "Good. You might need to help with the cattle sometimes, if you're willing." "I am." The prospect of learning ranch work was daunting but also exciting in a way Grace hadn't anticipated. That evening, Grace prepared a meal from the supplies available, a simple stew with the vegetables she had salvaged from the garden, enhanced with herbs and the last of the salt pork. Clayton seemed genuinely appreciative of the hot meal waiting for him after his day's work. "This is the best meal I've had in months," he said, helping himself to a second serving. Grace felt a small surge of pride. "It's not much. Once the garden is producing better, I can make more interesting dishes. This is plenty interesting for me." He broke off a piece of bread. "Where did you learn to cook?" "My mother taught me the basics. Then when I went to live with my aunt, I learned more. She insisted that a proper lady should know how to run a household, even if she might eventually have servants to do the actual work." Clayton smiled slightly. "No servants here, I'm afraid." "I prefer it that way," Grace said, surprising herself with the realization that it was true. "There's satisfaction in doing things with your own hands." They fell into a companionable silence as they finished their meal. Afterward, as Grace washed the dishes, Clayton sat at the table with a ledger, making notes about the day's ranch activities. "Would you like me to show you around the property tomorrow?" he asked without looking up from his writing. "You should know your way around if you're going to stay." The casual way he referred to her staying caught Grace off guard. She had been thinking of this arrangement as temporary a respite until she figured out what to do next. But perhaps Clayton was viewing it differently. "Yes, I would like that," she replied carefully. Clayton finally looked up, his blue eyes meeting hers directly. "I want to be clear about something, Grace. When I offered you a place here, I meant it as a real option, not just temporary charity, but I also understand if you want to move on eventually. There's a stagecoach that passes through the town 15 miles from here twice a month. If at any point you decide this isn't the life for you, I'll take you there myself." His frankness was both startling and refreshing. "Thank you for saying that. I don't know what I want yet." "Everything has happened so quickly." He nodded. "Take all the time you need to figure it out. No pressure from me either way." That night, as Grace lay in bed listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the Wyoming night, the distant howl of coyotes, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the creaking of the cabin as it settled, she thought about Clayton Reed and his unexpected kindness. There was something solid about him, reliable in a way Edward had never been despite all his polished charm and grand promises. She still didn't know if she could trust Clayton completely, but for the first time in months, she felt safe. And for now, that was enough. The days began to take on a rhythm as Grace settled into life at the Reed Ranch. Each morning, she rose early to prepare breakfast before Clayton headed out to tend to the cattle or repair fences, or any of the countless tasks required to maintain even a small ranch operation. She spent her days cleaning, cooking, tending the now thriving vegetable garden, and gradually taking on more responsibilities around the property. Clayton was true to his word about showing her the ranch. On her third day there, he took her on a tour of the entire property on horseback. Grace rode a gentle mare named Daisy, feeling a forgotten joy as they cantered across open meadows and picked their way through stands of aspen. "The property runs from that ridge to the east all the way to the creek we're coming up on," Clayton explained as they rode. "It's not the biggest spread in Wyoming, but it's enough for me to run about 100 head of cattle comfortably. It's beautiful land," Grace said, genuinely impressed by the sweeping vistas and varied terrain. "My father staked the claim 20 years ago. Came out from Pennsylvania with nothing but determination and a dream of open spaces." There was pride in Clayton's voice. "He and my mother built this place from nothing." "Are they?" Grace began hesitantly. "Both gone now. Pa 5 years ago from a lung ailment, Ma the year after. My sister married and moved to Oregon with her husband. It's just been me since then." "It must get lonely," Grace observed, immediately regretting her boldness. Clayton was quiet for a moment before responding. "It does, but there's always work to be done, which helps keep a man's mind occupied." They reached the creek, a different one from where Clayton had pulled Grace from the river, and dismounted to let the horses drink. The water burbled pleasantly over smooth stones, and wildflowers dotted the banks. "This is my favorite spot on the property," Clayton admitted, leaning against a boulder. "I come here to think sometimes." Grace knelt by the water's edge, trailing her fingers through the cool stream. "I can see why. It's peaceful. It reminds me that there's beauty in this world, even when times are hard." He glanced at her. "Something I think you needed reminding of too." Grace withdrew her hand from the water, suddenly self-conscious. "Yes, I suppose I did." Clayton moved to stand beside her, his expression serious. "I haven't asked about what happened at the river since that first night. I figured you'd talk about it when you were ready, but I want you to know that whatever drove you to that point, well, I'm glad you didn't succeed." His sincerity touched Grace deeply. "So am I," she whispered, realizing with some surprise that she meant it. As they continued their tour of the property, Clayton pointed out landmarks and shared stories about the land. Grace found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about the cattle operation and the seasonal rhythms of ranch life. "Winter's the hardest time," Clayton explained as they rode back toward the cabin in the late afternoon. "The snow can get deep, and keeping the cattle fed and watered is a constant battle. But spring makes it all worthwhile. Seeing the new calves watching the land turn green again. There's nothing like it. It sounds challenging but rewarding, Grace said. Clayton smiled, a rare, full smile that transformed his usually serious face. That's exactly what it is. Challenging but rewarding. As they neared the cabin, Grace realized that those same words could describe her new life here. Challenging, certainly, but with unexpected rewards she was just beginning to discover. That evening, as they sat by the fire after supper, Clayton surprised her by asking, "Can you raid?" "Of course," Grace replied, somewhat taken aback by the question. "My father was a school teacher before he opened his mercantile. He insisted I receive a proper education." Clayton nodded, looking pleased. "Would you mind reading aloud for a bit? I've got books, but after a long day my eyes get tired faster than my mind does." He retrieved a volume from a small bookshelf, a collection of Shakespeare's plays. "My mother used to read these to us on winter evenings." Grace took the book, oddly touched by the request. As she began to read from The Tempest, Clayton closed his eyes, listening intently. The domesticity of the moment struck her suddenly, the two of them sitting companionably by the fire, sharing literature as if they had known each other for years instead of days. When she finished the scene, Clayton opened his eyes. "You read beautifully. Your father taught you well." "Thank you," Grace said, closing the book carefully. "My father loved literature. He believed it could transport you to different worlds without ever leaving your chair. A wise man." Clayton stood and stretched. "I should turn in. Dawn comes early." As Grace lay in bed that night, she realized something startling. She had gone an entire day without thinking about Edward Parker or the shame and heartbreak he had caused her. Instead, her mind had been filled with creek water and wildflowers, cattle and horses, and the quiet companionship of a man who asked for nothing but offered everything. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. Was it possible to heal so quickly? Or was she merely postponing her grief by immersing herself in this new life? With these questions swirling in her mind, Grace drifted into sleep, dreaming of open meadows and a tall figure on horseback, silhouetted against the Wyoming sky. The weeks slipped by with surprising swiftness. June arrived, bringing longer days and warmer temperatures. The garden flourished under Grace's care, providing fresh vegetables for their meals. She learned to make butter from the milk of the 2 dairy cows Clayton kept, and to bake bread in the temperamental iron stove. Clayton began teaching her about the cattle operation, how to identify signs of illness, the basics of branding, and even how to help deliver calves. Grace discovered she had an aptitude for ranch work that surprised both of them. "You're a natural," Clayton commented one evening as they returned from checking on a heifer that had recently calved. "Most city folks take months to get comfortable around livestock." "I'm not entirely city folk," Grace reminded him. "I grew up in a small town outside Denver before we moved to the city, and my uncle had a farm we visited often." Their days fell into a comfortable routine. Clayton still did the bulk of the heavy ranch work, but Grace increasingly accompanied him on his rounds when the household tasks allowed. She found she enjoyed being outdoors, even in the heat of summer, and the physical work kept her mind occupied. In the evenings, they often sat on the small porch Clayton had built on the front of the cabin, watching the sun set over the distant mountains. Sometimes they talked, Clayton telling stories of growing up on the ranch, Grace sharing memories of her parents and her life before Edward Parker entered it. Other times they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It was during one of these quiet evenings in late June that Clayton broke the silence with an unexpected question. The town's having a 4th of July celebration. There'll be a dance and a picnic. Would you like to go?" Grace looked at him in surprise. They had not left the ranch together since her arrival, though Clayton occasionally rode into town for supplies. I'm not sure," she stammered, suddenly anxious at the thought of facing strangers who might ask questions about who she was and where she had come from. Clayton seemed to understand her hesitation. "It's a small town, but folks are friendly. Most are ranchers and farmers like me. They mind their own business." "What would you tell them about me?" Grace asked, voicing her main concern. Clayton considered this. "The truth, or as much of it as you're comfortable with. That you're staying at my ranch and helping me run the place. And what am I to you? Your housekeeper. You're—" She trailed off, unsure how to define their arrangement. "My friend," Clayton said simply. "If anyone asks more than that, they'll answer to me." The straightforwardness of his response eased Grace's anxiety somewhat. "In that case, yes, I would like to go." Clayton nodded, looking pleased. "Good. It's been a while since I attended any social gatherings. People were starting to think I'd turned into a complete hermit." Grace smiled at the image. "And we can't have that, can we, Mr. Reed?" "No, we certainly cannot, Miss Wakefield," he replied with mock seriousness, and they both laughed. It was the first time Grace had heard Clayton laugh properly, a rich, warm sound that transformed his usually solemn face. She found herself wishing to hear it more often. The laughter faded into a companionable silence as they watched the last light fade from the sky. Stars began to appear, brilliant against the darkening canvas of night. "I never saw stars like this in Denver," Grace mused. "The city lights dimmed them." "That's one of the best things about living out here," Clayton agreed. "Nothing between you and the heavens." As they sat there beneath the vast Wyoming sky, Grace felt a sense of contentment that had been absent from her life for longer than she cared to remember. The future was still uncertain, but for now, she was exactly where she needed to be. The days leading up to the 4th of July celebration were busy ones. There was always ranch work to be done, but Grace also found herself concerned with more personal matters, namely, what to wear to the dance. The dresses she had been using from Clayton's sister were serviceable for daily ranch life, but not suitable for a social event. She mentioned this hesitantly to Clayton one evening. "I was thinking," he said in response, "we should ride into town tomorrow anyway to get supplies. There's a general store that carries fabric. Maybe you could find something to make a new dress." "I am handy with a needle," Grace admitted, "but I wouldn't want you to spend money unnecessarily." Clayton waved away her concern. "The cattle sale last month was better than expected. We can afford some fabric and trimmings." The casual "we" didn't escape Grace's notice, and it warmed her in a way she hadn't anticipated. It had been a long time since she had been part of any kind of "we." The next day, they made the journey to the small town of Pine Creek. It was Grace's first time seeing the settlement, a single main street with a general store, a saloon, a small church, and a handful of other buildings. Despite its modest size, the town had a cheerful, busy atmosphere. "Most of these folks come from ranches and homesteads within a 20-mile radius," Clayton explained as they tied their horses outside the general store. "This is the social center for the whole area." Inside the store, Grace was delighted to find a reasonable selection of fabrics. She chose a pretty blue calico that would complement her eyes and some white lace for trim. Clayton added the items to his list of supplies without comment, but Grace noticed the approving look he gave her selection. While Clayton discussed feed prices with the storekeeper, Grace explored the rest of the store. She was examining a display of hair combs when she became aware of curious glances from two women nearby. "You must be the woman staying at Clayton Reed's place," one of them said, approaching Grace with an assessing look. She was perhaps in her 40s with a kind face despite her direct manner. "I'm Martha Wilson. My husband runs the livery." "Grace Wakefield," Grace replied, extending her hand somewhat nervously. "It's nice to meet you." "And I'm Emma Johnson," the second woman said, joining them. She was younger, closer to Grace's age. "My husband's the blacksmith. We haven't seen Clayton in town with company in, well, ever, I think." Grace wasn't sure how to respond to this implicit question about her relationship with Clayton. "I've been helping Mr. Reed with the ranch," she said carefully. Martha nodded, seeming to accept this explanation. "It's good he's got some help out there. That place is too much for one person to manage properly, especially the household parts. Clayton's a fine rancher, but I doubt the inside of that cabin had seen a proper cleaning in years." "It wasn't so bad," Grace defended automatically, then smiled when she realized how that sounded. Emma laughed. "Listen to her, already standing up for him. That's sweet." She lowered her voice. "Clayton Reed is one of the good ones, you know. After his parents passed, he could have sold the ranch and moved somewhere easier, but he stayed. Works harder than 3 men combined." "I've noticed," Grace said, relaxing a little as she realized the women weren't being judgmental, just curious in the way of small communities. "Will you be coming to the 4th celebration?" Martha asked. "Yes, we plan to attend." "Wonderful. We'll make sure to save you both a spot at our picnic table," Emma said enthusiastically. By the time Clayton finished his business and joined them, Grace was engaged in a lively discussion about the best way to preserve summer vegetables for the winter months. "I see you've met the town welcoming committee," he said with a slight smile. "We were just getting acquainted with Miss Wakefield," Martha replied, "and inviting you both to join our families at the celebration." Clayton looked mildly surprised but pleased. "That's mighty kind of you, Martha. We'd be happy to join you." As they rode back to the ranch later, Grace felt a strange mixture of emotions. The women had been friendly and welcoming, but their curiosity had reminded her of how unusual her living arrangement with Clayton must appear to others. "They seemed nice," she said finally, breaking the silence between them. "The Wilsons and Johnsons are good people," Clayton agreed. "Salt-of-the-earth types. They were curious about me, about us." Clayton glanced at her. "People always wonder about newcomers. It doesn't mean anything by it." "I know, it's just—" Grace hesitated, trying to articulate her feelings. "I'm not sure what to tell people about why I'm staying with you." "Tell them whatever you're comfortable with. You don't owe anyone your life story, Grace." His matter-of-fact response was reassuring. "Thank you for understanding," Clayton shrugged. "People have talked about me for years, the solitary rancher who rarely comes to town. One more thing for them to gossip about won't make much difference." The days before the celebration passed quickly. Grace worked on her new dress in the evenings after the day's chores were done, enjoying the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. Clayton seemed to find excuses to be inside more often during these times, occasionally glancing at her work with an interest that made her cheeks warm. The morning of July 4th dawned clear and promising to be hot. Grace was up early, too excited to sleep late. She laid out her new dress carefully and took extra time with her appearance, pinning her hair up in a style she hadn't bothered with since arriving at the ranch. When she emerged from behind the curtain that still served as her private space, Clayton was waiting. He had clearly made an effort with his own appearance. His usually shaggy hair was neatly combed, and he wore a clean shirt with a vest she had never seen before. He stared at her for a long moment before saying, "You look beautiful, Grace." The simple compliment brought a flush to her cheeks. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." Something passed between them in that moment, a recognition, perhaps, that they were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance, but something more. What that more might be, Grace wasn't ready to examine too closely. The ride to town was filled with anticipation. As they approached Pine Creek, they could see that the main street had been decorated with bunting and flags. A band was setting up on a platform near the church, and tables were being arranged for the community picnic. "Clayton, Grace, over here." Emma Johnson waved enthusiastically from a spot near a large oak tree where several families had gathered. The welcome they received was warm and genuine. Grace found herself quickly drawn into conversation with the women while Clayton chatted with their husbands. Children ran about playing games, their excited shrieks adding to the festive atmosphere. "That dress is lovely," Martha Wilson commented. "Did you make it yourself?" "Yes, just this week," Grace replied, pleased by the compliment. "You have a talent with a needle," Emma said admiringly. "You know, several of us were saying the town could use a good seamstress. Something to think about if you decide to stay in these parts permanently." The casual mention of permanence caught Grace off guard. She had been living day to day at the ranch, not thinking too far ahead. The idea of establishing herself in this community, of building a life here, was both appealing and frightening. Before she could formulate a response, the band struck up a lively tune, and people began moving toward the open area that had been designated for dancing. "Come on, everyone," called the mayor, a jovial man named Peterson. "Let's get this celebration properly underway." Clayton appeared at Grace's side. "Would you care to dance?" he asked, extending his hand. Grace hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd be delighted." They joined the other couples forming sets for a Virginia reel. Grace had learned the dance years ago, but it had been a long time since she had participated in such a gathering. Clayton, to her surprise, moved with unexpected grace for a man who spent most of his time on horseback. "You dance well," she commented as they circled each other. "My mother insisted all her children learn, said it was a necessary social skill, even on the frontier." There was a fond smile on his face at the memory. As they moved through the patterns of the dance, Grace felt a lightness she had almost forgotten. The music, the laughter, the sense of community all combined to lift her spirits. When the dance ended and another began, Clayton kept her hand in his, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and they stayed for another and then another after that. During a break while the musicians refreshed themselves, they returned to the shade of the oak tree. Grace was flushed and breathless, but happier than she had been in months, having a good time. Clayton asked, handing her a cup of lemonade. "The best," she replied honestly. "Thank you for bringing me." He smiled, that rare, full smile that transformed his features. "Thank you for coming. I haven't enjoyed one of these gatherings this much in years." As the day progressed, Grace found herself thoroughly enjoying the small town celebration. There were games and contests, speeches about liberty and the founding of the nation, and a magnificent picnic spread with dishes contributed by every family. In the late afternoon, while Clayton was engaged in a horseshoe contest with some of the other men, Martha Wilson sat down beside Grace. "It's good to see Clayton looking so happy," she said, following Grace's gaze to where Clayton was laughing with the other contestants. "He's been too much alone since his parents passed." "He's a kind man," Grace said carefully. Martha gave her a knowing look. "More than kind, I'd say. The way he looks at you when you're not watching. Well, I haven't seen that look on Clayton Reed's face ever before." Grace felt her cheeks grow warm. "We're just—" "You don't need to explain anything to me, dear," Martha interrupted gently. "Whatever is between you two is your business. I'm just glad to see it. Clayton deserves some happiness after all he's been through." Grace wanted to ask what Martha meant by all he's been through. But before she could, Clayton returned, victorious in the horseshoe contest. As the sun began to set, The celebration reached its climax with a modest display of fireworks brought in specially from Cheyenne. The entire town gathered to watch as bursts of color illuminated the darkening sky. Standing beside Clayton in the crowd, Grace felt his hand brush against hers. Almost instinctively, she moved her fingers to intertwine with his. He glanced down at her, surprise and something warmer in his eyes, then gently squeezed her hand. They stood like that, hand in hand, watching the fireworks explode overhead, a perfect ending to a perfect day. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see the trail clearly. In the distance, coyotes called to one another, their eerie yips echoing across the plains. "Thank you for today," Grace said as they approached the cabin. "It was wonderful." Clayton helped her down from her horse, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. It was good to see you smiling and laughing." There was something in his voice that made Grace look up at him. His face was half in shadow, but she could see the intensity in his gaze. "Clayton," she began, not sure what she wanted to say but feeling that something needed to be acknowledged between them. "We should get the horses settled," he said, breaking the moment. "It's been a long day." Grace nodded, both relieved and disappointed. As they led the horses to the barn, she wondered if she had imagined the tension between them. Later, as she prepared for bed, Grace caught her reflection in the small mirror Clayton had hung for her use. Her cheeks were still flushed from the day's activities, and her eyes seemed brighter than they had in months. The woman looking back at her was different from the desperate soul who had walked into the river seeking oblivion. That woman was gone, she realized. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had begun to find purpose again. And perhaps, someone who was beginning to feel things she had thought herself incapable of feeling after Edward's betrayal. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. July melded into August, bringing the hottest days of the summer. The work on the ranch intensified as they prepared for the fall cattle drive. Grace found herself more involved in the ranch operations than ever, riding out with Clayton almost daily to check on the herd. Their relationship had subtly shifted since the 4th of July celebration. There was an awareness between them now, an unspoken acknowledgement of feelings that neither seemed ready to voice. Small touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing while passing a plate became more frequent, each carrying a weight of meaning beyond the casual contact. One sweltering afternoon, they rode out to the creek to check on cattle watering there. The heat was oppressive, the air still and heavy with the promise of an evening thunderstorm. "The creek's running lower than I'd like," Clayton observed, dismounting near the water's edge. "If this heat keeps up, we might have to move some of the herd closer to the main river." Grace slid from her horse, feeling the relief of shade from the cottonwoods that lined the creek. "How many would you need to move?" "Maybe 20 head. The ones that look thinnest." Clayton removed his hat and wiped his brow. "It would be a full day's work." Grace watched as he knelt by the creek, splashing water on his face to cool off. In the months she had been at the ranch, Clayton had become leaner and more tanned from the outdoor work, the lines around his eyes deepening from squinting in the sun. There was something undeniably attractive about him, not in the polished, deliberate way Edward had been attractive, but in a natural, unaffected manner that she found increasingly compelling. As if sensing her gaze, Clayton looked up. "Something on your mind?" Grace shook her head, embarrassed to be caught staring. "Just thinking about how much work the cattle drive will be." "It's always a challenge," he agreed, rising to his feet. "But we'll manage. You've become quite the rancher these past months." The pride in his voice warmed her. "I've had a good teacher." Clayton smiled, then looked at the sky with a frown. Those clouds are building faster than I expected. We should head back before the storm hits." They had barely mounted their horses when the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Within minutes, it had become a downpour, the kind of sudden, violent storm common in Wyoming summers. "There's a line shack about a half-mile east," Clayton shouted over the rain. "We can wait it out there." They rode hard through the deluge, the horses' hooves throwing up mud as they galloped. By the time they reached the small shelter, little more than a one-room cabin used by cowboys watching distant parts of the herd, they were both soaked to the skin. Clayton quickly unsaddled the horses and led them to a lean-to attached to the shack. Inside, the shelter was sparse but dry, with a small iron stove, a rough wooden table with 2 chairs, and a narrow cot against one wall. "Not exactly luxurious, but it'll do until the storm passes," Clayton said, lighting a lantern that hung from a ceiling beam. Outside, thunder crashed and rain drummed against the roof. Grace wrung water from her hair, suddenly very aware of how her wet clothing clung to her body. Clayton seemed to notice too, quickly averting his eyes as he busied himself starting a fire in the small stove. "You should get out of those wet things," he said, his back to her. "There might be some old clothes in that trunk. Cowboys sometimes leave spare garments in the lined shacks." Grace opened the battered trunk and found a couple of work shirts and a pair of trousers. "I'll just turn around while you change first," Clayton said, still facing the stove. Grace changed quickly into one of the shirts, which was large enough to cover her to mid-thigh. The material was rough but dry, and she immediately felt better. "You can turn around now," she said. "And you should change too before you catch a chill." Clayton changed into the other shirt and trousers while Grace politely studied the patterns of rain running down the single window. When they were both in dry clothing, the atmosphere in the small cabin felt charged with an awareness that had nothing to do with the lightning flashing outside. "The storm doesn't look to be letting up anytime soon," Clayton observed, glancing out the window. "We might be here for a while." Grace nodded, unsure what to say. The small space seemed to amplify the tension between them. "Are you cold?" Clayton asked, noticing her slight shiver. "A little," she admitted. He gestured for her to sit on the cot, then joined her, carefully maintaining a respectful distance. "Body heat helps," he said, his voice gruff. Hesitantly, Grace moved closer until their shoulders touched. The simple contact sent a jolt through her that had nothing to do with being cold. "Better?" Clayton asked, his voice lower than usual. "Yes," she whispered, not trusting herself to say more. They sat in silence for a time, listening to the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. The storm showed no signs of abating, the rain falling in sheets that obscured the view through the window. "Grace," Clayton said finally, turning to face her. "There's something I've been wanting to say to you." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" He took a deep breath as if gathering his courage. "These past months having you at the ranch, it's changed things for me, changed me." "Changed how?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. "Before you came, I was just existing, going through the motions, doing what needed to be done but not really living." His eyes held hers, intense and honest. "You've brought life back to the place, back to me." Grace felt a tightness in her chest, a mixture of fear and something sweeter. "Clayton, let me finish," he said gently. "I know you came to the ranch under difficult circumstances. I know you've been hurt and you might not be ready to hear this, but I need to say it anyway." He took her hand in his touch warm and strong. "I've fallen in love with you, Grace Wakefield, completely and utterly in love." The words hung between them, momentous and transformative. Grace felt tears spring to her eyes, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his face. "You don't have to say anything back," Clayton continued quickly. I don't expect. Grace silenced him by placing her fingers gently against his lips. The day you pulled me from the river, she said softly, I thought my life was over. I couldn't imagine a future worth living. She moved her hand to cup his cheek. But you gave me a reason to keep going. Day by day, you showed me that there was still beauty in the world, still kindness and honor. Clayton turned his face to press a kiss into her palm, his eyes never leaving hers. I was afraid to trust again, afraid to feel anything after what happened with Edward, Grace continued. But you never pushed, never demanded, you just were there, steady and true. She took a shaky breath. And somewhere along the way, without even realizing it was happening, I fell in love with you too. The joy that spread across Clayton's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, a question more than a demand. Grace answered by sliding her arms around his neck, drawing him closer. The storm outside seemed to fade away as the kiss deepened, years of loneliness dissolving in the warmth of their embrace. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Clayton rested his forehead against hers. I never thought I'd find someone like you, he murmured. Nor I you, Grace replied, feeling as though her heart might burst with happiness. They stayed in the line shack until the storm passed, talking softly about their feelings, about the future, about possibilities neither had dared consider before. When they finally rode back to the ranch, the world seemed washed clean by the rain, colors more vibrant, the air fresher and filled with promise. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching another spectacular Wyoming sunset, Clayton took Grace's hand in his. I meant what I said in the line shack, he said quietly. I love you, Grace, and if you'll have me, I want to make this arrangement of ours permanent. Grace looked at him questioningly. I'm asking if you'll marry me, Clayton clarified, his expression both hopeful and vulnerable. Be my wife, my partner in everything. Help me build a life here. Grace felt tears of joy well in her eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you, Clayton Reed. His smile was radiant as he pulled her into his arms, sealing their promise with a kiss that held all the hope and love of new beginnings. The weeks that followed were filled with preparations for both the cattle drive and the wedding. They decided to marry after the drive was complete, in mid-October when the aspen trees would be golden, and the worst heat of summer passed. Word spread quickly through the small community. Martha Wilson and Emma Johnson arrived at the ranch one afternoon, bearing fabric for a wedding dress and offers of help with the ceremony. The church will be perfect, Martha declared. And afterward, we can have the celebration at the town hall. Grace was touched by their enthusiasm and support. You're all being so kind. I don't know how to thank you. Nonsense, Emma said, waving away her thanks. We're just thrilled to see Clayton settling down at last, and with someone as lovely as you. The cattle drive was a grueling but successful endeavor. Grace stayed behind to manage the ranch while Clayton and 2 hired hands took 60 head of cattle to the railhead at Cheyenne. When he returned 2 weeks later, tired but satisfied with the prices he'd secured, the reunion was sweet and passionate. I missed you something fierce, Clayton murmured against her hair as he held her close. The drive was half again as hard without you there. Next year I'll come with you, Grace promised. By then I'll be an experienced ranch wife. Ranch wife, Clayton repeated, savoring the words. I like the sound of that. September passed in a blur of activity. The garden yielded its final harvest, which Grace preserved for the winter months ahead. Clayton built an addition to the cabin, a proper bedroom for them to share after the wedding, with a real door instead of a curtain for privacy. As the wedding day approached, Grace found herself reflecting on the strange twists of fate that had brought her to this point. Had Clayton not been riding along the river that May day, had he not seen her and pulled her from the water, her life would have ended there. Instead, she had found not just survival but joy, purpose, and love. The night before the wedding, as they sat by the fire after supper, Grace shared these thoughts with Clayton. "You ever think about how different things might have been if you hadn't been there that day?" she asked. Clayton was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. "I think about it often," he admitted. "I wasn't even supposed to be riding along that stretch of river. I'd gone out to check on a stray calf and took a different route back than usual." The revelation sent a shiver through Grace. "It was meant to be then." "I'd like to think so." Clayton reached for her hand. "I'm not a man who believes much in destiny, but finding you, saving you, it changed everything for me." "For me too," Grace said softly. "You didn't just save my life that day, Clayton. You gave me a reason to live it." The wedding day dawned clear and crisp, the aspens along the creek a brilliant gold against the deep blue October sky. As Martha and Emma helped her dress in the small back room of the church, Grace felt a calm certainty about the step she was taking. Her wedding dress was simple but elegant ivory cotton with lace trim that she had sewn herself. Her hair was arranged in soft curls, adorned with tiny white flowers gathered from the meadow near the ranch. "You look beautiful," Martha said, her eyes misting with tears. "Absolutely beautiful." When the time came to walk down the aisle, Grace moved with steady steps toward Clayton, who waited for her at the altar. His face when he saw her was a picture of awe and love that she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. The ceremony was brief, but heartfelt. They exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to stand by each other through all of life's challenges and joys. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Clayton's kiss was tender and reverent, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration afterward was joyous music and dancing, food and laughter, the small community coming together to wish them well. As the evening drew to a close, they rode back to the ranch, now truly their home, beneath a canopy of stars. Standing on the porch of the cabin, their cabin, Clayton swept Grace into his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he said, carrying her across the threshold. "I've been home since the day you brought me here," Grace replied, her heart full to bursting with love for this man who had saved her in every way a person could be saved. Later, as they lay together in their new bedroom, the moonlight streaming through the window, Clayton traced the curve of Grace's cheek with gentle fingers. "I want you to know," he said softly, "that I will spend every day of the rest of my life making sure you never again feel so desperate that the river seems like your only option." Grace kissed him, pouring all her love and gratitude into the gesture. "And I will spend every day making sure you never regret pulling me out." As winter settled over the Wyoming plains, the Reed Ranch stood warm and welcoming against the snow and wind. Inside the cabin, Grace and Clayton built their life together day by day, working side by side, sharing dreams and plans, learning the rhythms of marriage. When spring came again, bringing new calves and green grass, Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought tears of joy to Clayton's eyes as he gathered her in his arms. "A baby," he whispered in wonder, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "Our baby, our baby," Grace echoed, marveling at how full her life had become in the space of a year. Standing by the creek one May afternoon, almost exactly a year after Clayton had pulled her from the river, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From despair to hope, from emptiness to fulfillment, from wanting to die to having everything to live for. Clayton came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her and resting his chin on her shoulder. penny for your thoughts, Mrs. Reed." Grace leaned back against him, feeling the solid strength of his chest against her back, his hands protective over the slight swell of her belly where their child grew. "I was thinking about how sometimes the end of one story is just the beginning of another," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "And how grateful I am that you were there to help me start a new chapter." Clayton kissed her forehead tenderly. "That day by the river, when I told you to live with me instead, I had no idea I was really asking you to share your life with mine forever." "I think maybe a part of you did know," Grace said, smiling up at him. "And a part of me heard what you were really asking, even then." As they walked hand in hand back to the ranch, their home, their future, Grace knew with absolute certainty that sometimes life's darkest moments could lead to its brightest days. And that love, when it was true and steadfast like Clayton's, had the power to heal even the deepest wounds. In the years that followed, as their family grew and the ranch prospered, Grace would often think back to that desperate day at the river. The memory no longer brought pain, but rather gratitude for second chances, for unexpected kindness, and for the courageous cowboy who had not only saved her life, but had shown her how beautiful that life could be when shared with someone who loved you completely. And whenever anyone asked how she and Clayton had met, she would smile and tell them the truth. "I tried to end my life in the river. He pulled me out and said, 'Live with me instead.' It was the best offer I ever accepted."